Good morning, everybody. There's a lot of you today, second service. A few things to say just before I get into the message. This is good news. Since Christmas Eve, Cornerstone has had our highest numbers in our history, at the exception of last week, where half of you stayed at home. But I was here. I took attendance, by the way. Just kidding. So that's great news. I mean, our children's ministry is packed. There are so many babies. We need more services to dedicate them in, and there's just been lots and lots of people here. You probably noticed that the building is a bit of a hindrance to our size. Now, we're so glad to have it, though, but there's just problems that are occurring with the great place that we're at. There are a lot of new people here, and this message is really for them. We want to ask you to start participating in what's going on here at Cornerstone, and you do that a number of different ways. Getting connected in groups. We have groups right now that are so full, we need new groups, and we need people to help form those groups. And so we would love to have some of you that have that skill and passion to do so. We need volunteers in our different ministries. There are a lot of babies and students to take care of. You take care of them the same way, by the way, middle school students and babies. Giving, of course, a part of that. Our attendance has been higher than it's ever been, but our giving's been down from even compared to last year. So we really need people to start contributing if this is now your home. For those of you visiting, just ignore what I had to say. But if you come back for another month, then remember what I had to say. All right? All right, enough of that. All right, let's get to the message this morning. I'm going to be teaching step number 8 in this series called Metamorphosis, a series all about change, experiencing a life of transformation. During this series, we've asked you to identify some area of your life that you would like to see change, and hopefully it's something that must change. It's so dysfunctional, it's causing so many problems, or you're so tired of it that you really are desperate, that you want something to change in your life. And we've used this box to illustrate that. The box is a great illustration because what we do with the things we struggle with is we hide it inside the box. And we put the box away and we keep it safe and we keep it secret. And we don't share it with other people and we manage it. Well, during the series, we opened up the box and we said, God, help us deal with this. Well, that was difficult for some people, but then it got harder because we said, hey, what's in the box isn't really the problem. Most likely there's a wound in your life or many wounds that need to be dealt with that are causing the dysfunctional behavior that appears on the surface. And so we started talking about wounds and dealing with those difficult things. And last week, Gene gave us a very practical step in the process of transformation, and it's the step of forgiveness. We've all been hurt. We have wounds. That hurt causes us to hurt other people, but the first step in practically seeing those things change is forgiveness. Today I get to teach the second side of that coin, the coin of forgiveness, and it's the other side of that is to make amends. And today we're calling the step to make a skillful amends, and I'm going to explain all this in a moment, but I do want to just say something about the word skillful. This step needs to be done with care. There are a few ways to do it right. There are many ways to do it wrong, all right? So let me just say it that way. That's why we put this word skillful in there, to make a skillful amends. To make an amends is to try to restore something that has been broken because of us, a relationship, trust, to restore something that's unjust because of our actions that are done on purpose or even just done by accident. Making amends is an important step. This step is not very fun, so I thought who better than to help us think about making amends for the things that we've done right, better than Earl Hickey and the show My Name is Earl. So I want to show you a clip from the intro of that. I'd love to show you an episode, but redneck inappropriate humor doesn't quite fit in a Sunday morning service, so we'll have to settle with just this. All right, we're going to have our own My Name is Earl episode this morning. Step number 8, the equivalent of that is step number 9 in the 12-step world, and this is what it says if you are going through something in an AA program or alcohol or Narcotics Anonymous, something like that. This is how it reads. To make direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or cause them harm. To make amends. To go to them, to ask for forgiveness. To make amends is more than an apology, but is not less. You get that? It's more than an apology. Has some action, some thought behind it, but it is not less. It definitely does include an apology. Now, this step, for us to really get it, we have to work within an assumption that I have, and that is that we all have certain things that we struggle with. I'm going to continue to assume that we all have been wounded, and because of those things, we act out in different difficult ways, not so healthy ways that hurt other people. So the assumption is that everyone in the room, even as great as you all are, that we have all hurt people with the thing that's in the box. And so, of course, there are examples like if you're addicted to something, there's all types of pain, many things to make amends for, stealing, lying, broken relationships. But even if you were to find something you might say is less serious, like just a negative way of thinking about yourself, okay? That's a dysfunctional behavior. And you know what it does is it shows up in people's lives by you being absent or not attentive, not your full self. So there are a number of ways that we hurt the people in our lives that matter most to us. Most often, when you get to this step practically and you begin to make amends with people, there are those in your life that are close, because they're the ones that we tend to hurt the most in our dysfunction. This step is not fun, but it's absolutely necessary if we want to experience long-lasting change in whatever area that is that you want to experience. We have to make this step. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it's very, very important. What I want to do today is I want to take you to 3 scriptures that make the case of why this is so important. I want to make the case that this actually has to do with worship, all right? And it's actually going to be pretty easy. There's a number of passages. I have 3 very obvious ones to make the case. This has everything to do with your relationship with God. It also has everything to do with your own health, the restoration of those relationships in your life. So I want to show you these passages. I also then want to get into how this actually looks practically. And I want to use the wisdom that comes from the 12-step world. They have some guidelines for making a skillful amends that we all need. You can write them down. They will be helpful to you when you begin this process. And then my hope is that in the days and weeks and months to come, where the work needs to be done, that you will do it. Because it's not just going to happen today. Hopefully this will spark something in you, and that you will go then to those people in your lives, and you will take this very, very seriously, and hopefully it will lead to the restoration, which is the desire behind any time we make an amends. So I want to take us first to Matthew chapter 5. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there. This is the longest sermon that we have of Jesus. He talks about a number of different things, but he actually talks about this subject. And he talks about the subject in regards to something that we're familiar with because we're all in this environment right now. He talks about making amends in the situation of worship and how those things go together. And so Jesus, teaching to a crowd, says this in verse 23. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there you remember your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come back and offer the gift. Now this is really confusing for a lot of people. But if you begin to understand it, you see how Jesus right now is already going to begin to clear up a problem that almost all of us have, whether you're a church person or a non-church person, a religious person, a non-religious person. Well, none of us like hypocrisy. None of us like things that are fake. Jesus, if you understand what he's saying here, he is addressing these things that we all dislike, and it's this hypocrisy, this religious hypocrisy that exists in people. And it has to do with the way we live in relationships with other people. Jesus uses this passage to make priority of relationships more than spiritual rituals or acts of traditional worship, we would say. Jesus is saying building, keeping, and restoring relationships is what matters most. So let's look at the passage closely. Starts off by saying, if you're offering your gift at the altar, this is just an expression of worship. It's always been a part of worship for the Jews and also for Christians to come into a service to offer things to God. We offer him our money. We offer him our time. We offer him our praise. That's the idea behind church. A lot of people don't like to hear it's not necessarily about us. This whole thing should be about God more than it is about us. And so Jesus is addressing a gathering just like this. A worship gathering where we come expecting something, wanting to give something. At this place, you're giving your gift at the altar, and you remember that your brother or sister has something against you. There's a key word in this part, and it's the word remember. Most of us don't need to remember that someone has hurt us, right? We feel that. We hold on to that. But we do need to remember, because we have this incredible ability to forget or think it wasn't that bad. We forget how we have hurt other people. And so we need reminders. Reminders sometimes show up as that person that we've offended or done something bad against, that when you see them in the grocery store or driving in their car and we kind of wince and we're embarrassed and we get into the other lane or go down the other aisle as fast as possible, right? That's a reminder. But look where the reminder comes in what Jesus is talking about. During worship. During worship, the reminder comes. It makes me think the reminder comes from God. God is saying, hey, I know you're here to pay attention to me and to listen to me. Here's something I want you to hear. Someone's got a real issue with you, and you're in here worshiping. That's a problem. The reminder comes in this setting of getting ready to worship. Now, I also want to say this. If you begin to make a list of the people that you need to make amends with everyone that has a problem with you, you will have more work to do than you can do in your lifetime. All right, there are a lot of people that have problems with me because I didn't start them, or because I threw them out of the church because they were preying on innocent girls. I'm never going to apologize to any of those people for any of those things, all right? And you have stories like that as well. But we do have real legit things that we've done to other people that God will remind us of. So this doesn't mean every person that has some little problem with you. These are the serious things, the things that we need reminded of, and when we're reminded of them, we know, yep, absolutely guilty of having done that thing. So the reminder comes in the midst of worship, and look what it says to do. Verse 24, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them. In other words, stop what you're doing and go make this a priority. Now, it would be easy to look at this and say that Jesus is minimizing what we know as worship, offering gifts to God, singing songs, gathering together. He's not minimizing anything. These things are important to him. But what Jesus is doing is he's putting something in front of that, and that is our relationships. This is so consistent for the message of Jesus. He's saying people matter more than ritual actions. Isn't that great news? But it's challenging to us. Jesus is saying the way that you build, keep, and restore relationships matters more to me than what you bring in as an offering to God. So first go to that other person. He's not so much comparing things here, but what Jesus is saying is he's expanding the definition of what it means to worship, to build healthy relationships, preserve them, to keep them going, and to restore those that aren't quite so the way that they're supposed to be. That is worship. That's what Jesus is saying. The way you love other people is the way you worship God. And it is the first way you worship God. If you struggle with people building, keeping, and restoring relationships, you will have a problem with God. I mean, it's all throughout this passage. It's in the next two that are to come. First, stop what you're doing and go to that person. He's talking about making amends. This step. Surprising to some people that it's in the scriptures. There's another place that this occurs, and it's in the Hebrew Bible. It's one of the Jewish prophets, Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 58, starting in verse 3. Isaiah is incredible. He had many different important messages. One was about care for the poor, but one that we're going to see here is he's using the poor as an example to make this point, this bigger point, that the way you live among other people is really the foundation of your worship. And if you live badly with other people, then your ritual actions are meaningless to God, and he doesn't even want them. And he even uses stronger language than Jesus. So starting in verse 3, it says, yet on the day of your fasting, and what is fasting? But it's an act of worship, giving something up for God. You do as you please and exploit all your workers. Oh, mention of a person, bad treatment of others right away. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. Goes on to say in verse 6 that you're exploiting others, those that are weak. You take advantage of them. Verse 7, he says you actually ignore the poor. And because of that, God does not want your fast. He doesn't want this other thing that's in here about making yourself humble and covering yourself in sackcloth and ashes. It was a ritual, a practice, an act of worship during this time. So all these things are meaningless because you fight, you exploit, you're unjust, and you ignore the people around you that have need. Now, of course, he's making a point here, I think, that makes every follower of Jesus turn their attention to those that are poor. I think God gives us a preference to the poor. But the macro principle is here that you will have a problem with God if you have a problem with other people that you cannot overcome. Now, this doesn't mean that the conflict's not going to occur, that we're going to have a difficult time with difficult people, that it's our job to be people pleasers and have everyone happy with us. That's not what we're talking about. But these are acts against someone else that are being ignored. And God says you can't ignore them. I see them, can't ignore them. These take precedent. They are a priority. And the way that you build, keep, and restore relationships is the first step of being a worshiper of God. It's incredibly practical, but it shatters all of our ideas about what it means to be a spiritual person. So Isaiah makes the point. But then Paul makes the point a few thousand years later. 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 27 and 28. Paul's writing to early Christians, but Paul is a Jewish rabbi himself, so he's pulling all of these things in together. He's writing to a group of people kind of like us who are already fighting. Churches fight. There's bickering and division among them, but it's not any different than the world. The world fights. There's backbiting everywhere. But Paul's saying things should be different, but he makes this connection. You have a problem with other people, there's now a problem with your worship. And he connects it to something that's even more precious to many of us than making offerings or fasting, and it has to do with something that we know as communion, taking the elements, the Lord's table. This is one of those practices that's very, very dear to so many people. It's a revised Passover. So, you could even say this represents the Passover for Jews. It represents the elements for Christians. And look what Paul says. So then, whoever eats the bread and drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and the blood of the Lord. Oh, I hate verses like that. I like it when it's gray. Everyone ought to examine themselves before they eat the bread and drink the cup. The element's important? Absolutely. But Paul's saying, hey, you're doing it in an unworthy manner. Now the question is, what does it mean to take the elements in an unworthy manner? I was first taught by a pastor that what he's talking about here is when churches let everyone take the elements. That when you let someone who's not yet a believer take the elements, or when you let someone take the elements who's not yet a part of your church and is not a proper member or doesn't share all of your beliefs, there's a whole bunch of rules around the right ways to take the elements. But I'm going to let you do this work yourself. But if you look up 2 paragraphs, you're going to see exactly what it is that they're doing that causes them to take the elements in an unworthy manner. It has nothing to do with belief or doctrine or commitment to a particular church. What do you think it has to do with, based on my message? People and the way you treat people. They're already fighting. They're building camps. They have divisions in churches. People are leaving, starting their own things, going to different things, and they have unresolved conflict. And Paul says, that is why you're taking this in an unworthy manner. It's the same message all over again. You think this is what God wants, but the priority is the way that you love people, build relationships, keep them, and restore them. And the making amends step is all about restoring relationships and really keeping them. Because if you can't make amends, you're really not going to continue with any meaningful relationship in your life. So he's making the very same point. The priority is people. Now here's what's great about it. When you do these things, and really one of my friends described it as cleaning up your side of the street. When you clean up your side of the street, you know what God says? Then come back to the altar. Offer your sacrifice. Then come back, offer your fast. Then come back, enjoy and remember the Lord. But it's pretty clear, isn't it? 3 different writers over a course of a couple thousand years, that this is what matters most to God. And it has everything to do with worship. And if you think about worship, the reason we worship is we want to offer something to God, hopefully, but we also want to feel close to Him. want to experience his presence. If you have a hard time experiencing him, hearing his voice, experiencing his presence, it could be because you have a lot of unresolved issues with people in your life. This step will be very, very helpful for you if you take it. So it's really clear to me that this is a priority throughout the scriptures. That's why this step is very, very important. So then the question becomes, all right, if you're convinced to do it, how do we do it? And how do we do it well? How do we do it skillfully in a way that we won't hurt other people? I want to share 4 parts to making an effective amends. Almost all of this that I'm going to share comes from the wisdom that comes from the 12-step world. One of my buddies who's been helping me with all of the messages, he said, usually when you're an addict and you're in the 12 steps, your list of amends is very long. And so we have lots of experience of making amends. And so we're going to rely on their wisdom. It's very, very good stuff. And so I want to share 4 parts to making an effective amends. First one, don't plan on this or prepare for this alone. You need some help. You need the wisdom that comes from other people. Why? First of all, you need to judge your intent. What are your motives behind wanting to make this amends? Is it all about you, or is it about the other person? You also need another person to come in and say, is this appropriate? Will it be helpful, or will it cause more harm? We cannot make these decisions on our own. We need a friend, we need a spouse, we need a sponsor, we need a discipler to help us kind of wade through our emotions to figure out, is this the right thing to do? Not only that, once we determine if it's the right thing to do, we need some help in determining when to do it and how to do it. An author we're reading for this series said, one often needs time, discernment, and good advice from others before one knows when, how, and who, and where to apologize and make amends. So you need some help. So don't do it alone. That's part 1. Part 2, whenever possible. It's not always possible, but whenever possible, do it in person. Sometimes you need to break the ice, maybe other means of communication. But do not rely only on text and Facebook to have meaningful conversations and relationships. Let me say that again. Especially to all the people my age. Nothing replaces face-to-face. If it can't be face-to-face, a conversation on a phone. I mean, how many of us avoid answering the phone? It's just like, just send me a text. I do not want to have to connect with you, burn emotional energy. Listen to your tone. All right, this isn't just a sharing of information. This is a sharing of your heart and what God is doing. So when possible, do it in person, over the phone. There's times you need to break the ice. You're going to hear a story about that in a moment. Part 3. This one's very, very important. And it's to accept full responsibility for what you've done. Now, this is hard because in relationships, there are always 2 ways. And no one is ever perfect. So even though you're coming to another person to make amends, they probably have things that they've done to hurt you. And it would be nice. It would be incredible if they made amends. But you can't have any expectation of that, and you need to come just ready to take full responsibility for what you've done. Now, this is hard. What this means is during your amends, you don't say things like, yeah, I know I was a total jerk, and I hurt your feelings, and I embarrassed you in that moment, but I wouldn't have done it if you wouldn't have acted like that. Okay, failure right there. That's a bad amends. It's better to stay home and be quiet, all right? It's better to stay home and watch My Name is Earl. He'll give you some helpful tips. You take full responsibility with no expectation that you'll receive anything in return. I had a friend who went through this step, and he illustrates this perfectly. He was up here a few weeks ago. His name's Chris Vincent, and he couldn't be here today because he's out of town. But he was telling me that as moving through the process of changing and recovering from alcohol, he was working through this step, making amends, and he had a long list of people that he had hurt over decades of being an alcoholic. But there was one on the list that was really difficult for him, and it was amends that he had to make with his father. And the reason that amends was difficult is because his dad was also an alcoholic who was also abusive. And if you were to compare the things that Chris has done against his dad to the things that his dad had done against him, it wouldn't even be close. His dad had hurt him much more than Chris could have ever hurt his own father. But he knew that this was important and that something opens up, something is free. There's a breakthrough that takes place when you make this step. And so he flew to Boston. He met with his dad with no expectations, owned his part. I bet he was hoping that his father would make amends to him. That didn't happen that day. Chris made full amends for the things that he had done. Now listen to that. An alcoholic, abusive father, the son is making amends to him. Seems weird, but it's actually beautiful because what it leads to. He came home from that, grateful about the experience, but he said, you know, the reward really came later on. A few years later, his dad got sick and was dying. And Chris went back to the East Coast to be with him, and he said, if it wouldn't have been for that step of making amends, I would have been there caring for my dad, and I would have been very conflicted and disturbed because of our relationship. But because I had made amends and also forgiven, I was free to love my dad, enjoy him for who he was with no expectations. And that was a gift that God gave me. His exact words. I'm so grateful that God gave me that gift. See, this is a gift. Any part of healing is difficult, but it's always a gift. It always has a reward. Make the amends in person. Take full responsibility. Part of number 3 also includes asking the person after you go through the list of specific things, hey, have I missed anything? Because you probably have. So then it gets even better. You get to listen to them tell you about the things that you've done that you can't even remember. But you just listen, you smile, and you say, all right, I apologize. Please forgive me. Part 4 of an effective amends is asking how you can make things better. And this is really a step of action. There's a story in the book of Genesis, Jacob and Esau. Jacob stole something precious from his brother. He could never give it back. They'd been estranged for years. He sees his brother. He asks for forgiveness. He says, please take these gifts as an act of repaying and restoring the thing that had been broken. He really never could pay back what he had taken, but it's part of making an effective amends. So for many people, usually what it is it's not necessarily paying back people, because most people don't steal. It's not giving them back time because you didn't steal time, but it's saying, hey, I'm going to live differently. You will now experience a new me. And you know, when a person lives different, isn't that a gift? When they come to you and say, I've done this, I know I have, I'm sorry I did it, I know I hurt you, and then we see them living differently, we experience them different, what a gift that is. That's the action that must come. Words are cheap, but not if they're backed up by action. If they're backed up by action, words mean something, and we need them to mean something when we make an amends. So that's the 4th part. Now, I want you guys to hear a real-life story. Where's Becky? Come on up. Of someone who has been working through this very step. She's a little bit ahead of us in the series, which is awesome because she can come and share. This is Becky, and she's going to share about just this transforming process. She's had a really traumatic life, and it's left her with a lot of wounds, and she can tell you more about that, but she's in the process of making amends, and she has one really special story to share with you.
Hi. I was born and raised in a family where my father was an alcoholic and my mother worked 3rd shift, so we were always told to be quiet, mom's sleeping, or dad's home, get to bed. That left us being totally unsupervised as teenagers, me and my brothers, and we all got into drugs and alcohol. The only difference between them and me is that they got caught. I never got caught. Even into my 20s, 30s, 40s, I never got caught. They did. Back in the year 2000, I moved in. I was on the East Coast in Connecticut, and I decided I wanted to move back to my hometown, Waukesha, Wisconsin, and I asked my little brother if I could live with him, and he said, yeah. When I got there, he was fishing, he had a good job, he looked healthy, he looked well, and his life he was just fine. I thought he was just fine. A couple months later, I was bartending in the local downtown bar, and I began to bring people back home with me that sold drugs and did drugs, and me and my brother would do drugs together. And there was one morning when I woke up, my brother lost his job. He wasn't fishing anymore. He was went total downhill. I didn't know that he had problems with drugs earlier. I didn't know that he struggled with drug and alcohol abuse, and he'd gone through the 12-step program, and we never talked about that when I moved in with him. And I woke up one morning, and I thought he was dead. He was sitting on the couch. His jaw was all dropped. He was so skinny, I couldn't see him breathing through his sweatshirt, and I took off out of the house, and I went and got my friend who works in a hospital, and she came over and slapped him. You know, Danny, wake up, and he woke up, and I told him I wanted to get him help, and because he didn't have any insurance and that, and there was nothing I could do, and he told me to just get out of the house, get out, move out, and I did. I moved out that day, and I never spoke to him again. About a couple months later, I saw him on Facebook, and I just freaked out. He was healthy. He was living in Florida now. He had this little boy that was in his arms, and I'm like, what is going on here? I found out that through Facebook, and I know we're not supposed to do it this way, but...
Let me add one thing I think it might have got missed. There was 15 years
since
between when she left the house and she noticed him on Facebook.
Right.
Okay. It was 15 years, not communicating.
And he had been homeless. He'd been living at Salvation Army. He, burned all his britches and whatever. Anyway, so I saw him on Facebook, and when I started this class, which is during the second service, the 12-step program, I thought, I'm going to do it. Both my brothers went through it. My father went through it. A lot of people I know are in Celebrate Recovery. I've never heard of it before, and this whole thing in this church has just totally changed my life. So I wrote Danny a message, and the first thing I wrote to him, which was January 31st, I wrote, Dan, I really need to talk to you, please. Then I went to get help, and I was told that I sound too desperate. So immediately I wrote him another letter or another message saying, Dan, I owe you years of apologies. And I waited all day, and didn't hear nothing. And finally that night he wrote me back, and he said, no, you don't. That's all he said. After 15 years, those were his first words to me is, no, you don't. So the next morning was Sunday, and I came to church here, and that's the service where Gene said, write something that you've never told anybody on a piece of paper, and then he stopped us, and he said, write how you feel about that. So I wrote the word shame. I came up, and I left the word on the piece of paper on the altar. When I got out to my car in the parking lot, my brother had I wrote this to him. I said, I started a new Bible study class, and I'm reading Serenity. This book serves as a companion for a 12-step recovery. I've come to terms with the guilt and shame for many things I did in my past. Many involved my part in your struggles. I am sorry. This may not mean a lot to you. However, to me it means, I'm sorry. This may not mean much to you. However, to me it means a lot. And I waited, and later on, he wrote to me, it is what it is. Without the past, we wouldn't be in the present. Everything had to be the way it was. At times, I feel guilt and shame, but it's a waste of time to dwell on it. The present is where we are. And at that point in time, this whole emotion of guilt and shame was lifted from me, and I just thought, I've got the coolest little brother ever. He's just so awesome to feel that way. And I wrote him back, thanks, Dan. I feel much better knowing that you feel and think that way. And that was the end of our conversation. Now I bought a ticket, and I'm going to Florida, and I'm going to hang out with my sober brother and create some new memories that we've never had before. And just, it's going to be awesome. On May 3rd, I'm going to Florida to see my little brother.
Good job. Step 8 takes incredible courage, and you've got to have some people helping you. You got to be brave to do this, but something happens when we do it. God uses it. Something opens up, and I want to mention some of these benefits just before I leave and we finish with worship. The first benefit, hopefully, is obvious. At least in the series, that this is part of the changing process, the healing process, the transformational process. You can't skip it. We absolutely need it. And so if there are things in your life that you want to see change, relationships, thought patterns, addictions, you can't skip this step. I wish we could, but we can't. Whatever's in the box of the wounds that you have, this is part of the healing process. Just as forgiveness is, so is making amends. So that's a benefit. The second benefit is the benefit that you give other people. What a gift she's going to give her brother. What a gift to ask for forgiveness of someone that you've hurt. What a gift when the relationship is restored or made better or trust is rebuilt. What a gift that you can give these people. By the way, part of being a healthy person is putting the needs and desires of other people ahead of yourself. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but it's thinking of yourself less. And it's a gift when you give this to other people. It's part of the healing process. I hope that your relationships are restored. They might not be, because part of making amends is you never know how it's going to go. Sometimes it's worse than you expect. Sometimes it's better. So you never know. But it's a gift that you can give someone else. But the third one is kind of in this message, and it's this connection that you get with God. You struggle with God, there's a good chance it's because you struggle with other people. One reason you might struggle with other people is because you struggle with God. They go hand in hand. But when we begin to live in such a way that we are worshiping with our lives, and the essence of worshiping with our lives is how we handle the people in our lives, the manner in which we love them. And by the way, we need to love people under God's standard, not our own. When we define what love is, we will always come up with a lesser definition of love. Always. We need Him to define it. But when we grow in our ability to love people effectively, and really how it shows up is building, keeping, and restoring relationships. When we do that, we realize that God is close. The end of that Isaiah passage has these then statements. Then you'll notice how close God is. There He is. It actually says this: when you make things right with people, then your healing will appear. Isn't this about healing? Then your healing will appear. Then when you call out to the Lord, it says, He won't be far away. You'll hear Him say, here am I. I'm close. I'm with you. You're not alone. There are so many benefits that come from this. And the greatest one is this connection with the Lord. If there's anyone in the room that has never made that connection with God, now's an awesome time to do it. To make amends with God. To come to Him and say, I have done things that have broken our relationship and I want it restored. But here's the thing with God and our relationship with Him. He says, you know, I've already done everything needed to make it restored. But He does want us to come to Him with a humble heart, saying, please forgive me. And you can do that work today. You can begin that relationship with God, and then you can begin to do the work of what it means to worship by loving other people well. Our church, by the way, the work of the church is to be about helping one another do that better. That's our job. We help each other do that. And so this is a place to help you grow in that relationship. All right, I'm going to close in prayer, and then these guys are going to lead us with one last song. Father, it says in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 that the work of Jesus is the work of reconciliation, that He comes to restore broken relationships, to redeem them, to bring them back, and that God, that you actually, when you touch our lives and you restore us back to you, you now give us the life and the message of reconciliation. Lord, I pray that we would understand that means to announce the work that you've done, but I also pray that we would understand that means to live out the work that you've done, that we would be people who go to others to make amends. And so, Lord, for every person that's afraid right now, for every person that knows someone in their life they need to go to, for every one of us this week that are reminded of people that we can't think of right now or in the months to come, I pray, God, that we would realize that you're with us, that you will give us what we need, and that we will make a skillful amends when that's necessary. And Father, we do expect that there will be some benefits from it. And so, Lord, we look forward to our healing. We look forward to noticing how close you are. We look forward to having our worship and gatherings like this be even more meaningful because they match the quality of our life. And so I pray you would help us. Speak to us, Lord. Show us who that is. We need your help, God. This is so difficult. But I pray that we would see you leading us in this process, speaking to us. And we love you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, let's stand together.